Two people went missing, a father and daughter. They vanished without a trace. The Great Smoky Mountains, a place that should have felt peaceful, now felt suffocating. The father, Daniel and Sophie, a former army medic, and his 10-year-old daughter, Sophie, went for a simple hike, one they'd done countless times before. But this time, they didn't come back. No calls, no messages, nothing. Days passed. The search grew frantic. Yet, no signs of where they'd gone, no evidence. Not even a single trail of where they'd wandered. That's when the hunters were called in. 3 of them, seasoned trackers, familiar with these woods more than anyone else. They knew how to follow a trail. But what they found here wasn't a normal disappearance. The first sign came on the 3rd day of the search. Fresh tracks, one set large, the other small, leading off the main trail and deep into the dense, wild woods. At first glance, it seemed like any other set of footprints. But the deeper they followed, the stranger it became. No sign of a struggle, no broken branches, no clues, just 2 sets of footprints leading straight into nothing. The hunters paused. There was no way they could be the only ones who'd seen it. Daniel and Sophie and Sophie were out there, somewhere. But the tracks didn't make sense. These weren't the tracks of people who had wandered off the trail. These were purposeful, deliberate steps. Almost as if they'd known where they were going. "Let's follow them," one hunter suggested, but his voice was already tinged with doubt. They followed the tracks, deeper into the wilderness, but the forest felt wrong. Too quiet. Something didn't add up. The tracks led them further into the trees, but then they just stopped. Vanished. Not even a sign of where they might have gone next. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a simple case of getting lost. There was something else at play here. With every step, the hunters felt a growing sense of unease. They'd seen tracks before. Tracks that led to the edge of the woods, to shelters, to campsites, to the places people went when they were lost. But these tracks led to nothing. Just the forest. Silent. Waiting. And with every step they took, the more they felt like they were walking toward a truth they didn't want to find. But they didn't turn back. Not yet. Because they weren't just looking for Daniel and Sophie and Sophie anymore. They were hunting a mystery. A story that was still unfolding. One that no one could explain. A story of a father and daughter who had disappeared without a trace. And now, the hunters were part of it. There was no turning back. The woods were hiding something, and it was about to reveal itself. The first thing they found was the car. Daniel and Sophie's Subaru Outback, parked neatly at the trailhead, the engine long cold. The doors were unlocked, and everything inside seemed in its place. Sophie's backpack, a water bottle in the cup holder, her favorite birding book, still sitting on the seat. But there was something off. Something wrong. The hunters, now a few miles into their search, had already seen the tracks. The ones leading off the trail. Fresh. The larger set belonged to a man. The other, much smaller, belonged to a girl. The tracks weren't scattered or random. They led somewhere. Purposefully, the hunters followed them through the woods, thinking they'd find a campsite or a hidden trail. But there was nothing. No broken branches. No discarded gear. No sign of where the trail had gone. Just the tracks. Vanishing. They'd come across these kinds of tracks before. Lost hikers. People who wandered off the main trail and got turned around. But this was different. The steps were too deliberate, like someone was trying to get somewhere, and fast. And yet, there were no signs of struggle. No calls for help. Nothing. Nash, one of the hunters, was the first to break the silence. "This doesn't make sense." His voice was low, but the unease was unmistakable. Jared, the oldest and most experienced, crouched down, examining the prints. "I don't know. They're heading in, not out." He glanced back at the car, still parked in plain view. No signs of a fight. No panic. No broken glass. It was as if they had just walked away from everything, like they knew exactly where they were going. "It doesn't add up," Tom muttered. looking around. The woods were thick, and the air felt too still. The usual sounds of wildlife were gone, replaced by the unsettling silence that seemed to cling to everything. They had seen people go missing before. Lost hikers, sometimes. A wrong turn, a broken leg, a flash flood. But there was always something. Always a clue. A scream. A sign of distress. Here, there was only the quiet. The tracks led them farther into the dense woods, deeper than any official trail would take them. And then, just like that, nothing. The prints ended abruptly, disappeared into thin air. Where did they go? Nash asked, his voice rising with frustration. They didn't just vanish, Jared said, shaking his head. There has to be something. We are missing something. But what? The hunters had combed the area, checked every possible route, and still there was nothing. The forest didn't give up its secrets easily, but this wasn't normal. The only thing they had left was the car, sitting quietly at the trailhead, like it had been waiting. Everything in it looked like they'd been preparing for a short hike, maybe even a weekend getaway. But no one had come back. The hunters exchanged glances. They weren't just dealing with a missing persons case. This was something else. Something the woods hadn't shown them yet. They had found the tracks. They had found the car. Now, they needed to find the rest of the story. The trailhead was quiet. Too quiet. The Subaru Outback sat alone in the gravel lot, just like the sheriff had described. No one had come to claim it. The car was parked neatly, facing the woods, its engine long cold. The doors were unlocked, but nothing seemed out of place. It was as though Daniel and Sophie had stepped out and never returned. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances as they approached. Nash opened the back door and peered inside. A small backpack sat on the seat, Sophie's favorite bird-watching journal peeking out from the side. The pages were worn, dog-eared from countless adventures in the woods. I don't get it, Jared muttered, leaning against the car, scanning the surrounding woods. They were here, no doubt. But where did they go? Everything's still in place, Nash said, pulling out Sophie's journal. He flipped through the pages, but there was nothing unusual, just drawings of birds, sketches of trees, little notes about the hikes they'd taken together. It looked like any normal entry from a weekend trip. Tom stood back, his gaze fixed on the dense trees ahead. If they were here, they couldn't have gone far. The hunters knew these woods. They had walked every inch of these trails countless times, following animal tracks and knowing when to listen for the quiet hum of nature. But there was nothing here. No signs of Sophie and Daniel, not a single fresh footprint on the dirt around the car. Just the silence. Jared sighed and pulled out his map. The trailhead led in two directions. One looped around the mountain, the other continued deep into the heart of the forest. Daniel and Sophie were supposed to be on the second trail, the one that took them deeper, past the creek and up to the ridge. Let's check the main trail first, Jared suggested, his eyes scanning the surroundings. If they're anywhere, they're probably there. The three hunters began to move down the path, each step crunching in the stillness of the morning. The trees towered overhead, their thick branches blocking out the light. A damp chill clung to the air, the faintest hint of fog still drifting between the trunks. But even as they moved forward, the hunters couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They kept their eyes on the ground, looking for any sign of where Daniel and Sophie had gone. The trail was clean, undisturbed. No recent footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if the pair had just vanished into the woods. By the time they reached the first junction in the trail, there was still no sign of them. Nothing. No campsites, no gear left behind, not even a trail marker to indicate they'd been in the area. The further they went, the more unsettling it became. Maybe we should have called in more backup, Nash muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow, though the air was cold. This doesn't feel right. Tom didn't respond. He just kept walking, his eyes scanning the trees, the ground, the horizon. He'd been hunting these woods for years, but today, he couldn't explain it. The silence. The way the trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It felt like they were being swallowed. Jared halted ahead. He bent down to inspect the dirt at the base of a tree, his fingers brushing the ground. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the faintest impression in the mud. It was so small, so subtle, almost imperceptible, that if you weren't looking closely, you'd miss it. A single set of footprints, Daniel's. But they were old, worn down by time and weather. And when Jared turned his attention to the rest of the area, nothing. No other signs of movement. It was as though Daniel had stepped away from the trail, left this single mark behind, and simply walked into the woods. "God damn it," Nash hissed under his breath, kicking the dirt in frustration. "How does someone just disappear like this? There's no trail, no sign of anything." Jared stood up, looking out into the deepening woods. "We'll keep searching. But something's off about all this. They couldn't have just walked into the forest and disappeared." Tom stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the trees ahead. "We'll find them. But there's something wrong here. This isn't just a case of someone getting lost." The three hunters exchanged looks, the weight of the moment settling on their shoulders. The tracks, Daniel's footprints, were all they had. They weren't going to give up, not yet. But something told them this wasn't going to be a simple search. The woods were holding on to its secrets, and it wasn't going to give them up easily. The air shifted. It started as a soft, faint sound, a whistle, barely audible over the rustling of leaves. It was so subtle, it could have been the wind. But the woods had been silent for too long, and this was something different. The sound was deliberate, almost too human. It felt wrong. The hunters paused, their eyes scanning the trees, their senses on high alert. It was Tom who broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" The others nodded, but none of them spoke at first. It wasn't just the sound of a whistle, it was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks rise. It was a sound they had heard of before, but only in stories, never in reality. The whistler, a local legend. The kind of myth that was passed around campfires and whispered behind closed doors. Some said the whistler was a spirit of the forest, a ghostly figure who led people off the trail, deep into the wilderness, where they would disappear without a trace. Those who heard the whistle were compelled to follow it, drawn further and further into the unknown, until they vanished, just like the others who had been taken. But the hunters didn't believe in spirits. At least, not at first. They were men of reason, trained to read the woods like a book, to track animals, to understand the world through logic and experience. But as they stood there, in the middle of the dense forest, the whistle echoed again, this time a little louder, a little clearer. It came from deeper within the trees. Nash looked at Jared. "Could be just some animal, right? A bird or—" "No," Jared cut him off, his voice tight. He had spent more time in these woods than he cared to remember. He knew the sounds of the animals here, the birds, the creatures that roamed these parts. This wasn't one of them. "That's not any animal," Tom said, his voice low. He turned toward the others. "That's the whistler." Nash let out a short laugh, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that came from humor. It was nervous, uncertain. "Come on. It's just a story. Old town mythology." Jared was quiet for a long moment. The whistle echoed again. This time, it was much closer, almost as if it was right behind them. The sound twisted the air, making everything feel just a little colder. "I've heard the stories," Jared said, finally. "The whistler doesn't just lead people astray. They disappear. It's said to pull people into the woods, and once they're gone, they're never seen again." Nash looked at Jared, then Tom. "But that's just superstition, right? We don't believe that stuff." Tom shook his head slowly, his face grim. "I don't know, Nash, but something's not right here. You feel that?" He gestured to the silent woods, the eerie stillness that surrounded them. "This is more than just bad luck. It's like the forest is waiting for something." The hunters stood there for a few beats, listening to the faint whistle that came and went with the wind, like a beckoning call from deep within the trees. There was no explanation for it, No reason they could point to that made any logical sense. But everything inside them screamed that it wasn't just coincidence. "We need to keep moving," Jared said, breaking the tension. "We're too deep now to turn back without answers." Nash frowned. "But what if the Whistler is real? What if we're walking right into whatever it is that took Daniel and Sophie?" Jared's face hardened. "We don't have a choice. We find them, or we end up another story for the locals to tell." The group fell silent as they moved deeper into the forest. The whistle was still there, always just out of reach, like it was leading them forward. The air grew colder with each step, and with every whistle, the woods seemed to grow darker. They were being drawn in. But by what? The hunters had heard the myths. They had laughed at them in the past. But now? Now, it was harder to laugh, because something about the whistler felt real. Too real. They pressed on, the sound of the whistle echoing in their ears. And with every step, it felt like they were walking towards something they couldn't escape. The sun was low now, casting long shadows through the trees. The silence was almost oppressive, the only sound the crunch of the hunters' boots on the forest floor as they continued to search. They had reached the point where the trail seemed to die out. No more tracks, no signs of movement, just endless trees and thick underbrush. The deeper they went, the less they felt like they were getting closer to Daniel and Sophie. The woods seemed to swallow every trace, every clue. Then Nash spotted it. "Hey!" he called out, crouching down by a pile of leaves and moss. His fingers brushed the damp earth, revealing something half buried beneath the debris. At first, it looked like just another discarded piece of trash, scraps of paper, maybe a ripped bag or a few broken branches. But as he pulled it out, he saw that it wasn't trash. It was a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, soaked from the rain. The cover was dark, almost black with age, but the initials DM were embossed in gold on the front. Daniel M.C. Cray. Nash hesitated for a moment before he carefully opened it, flipping past the first few pages. The ink was faded, some pages nearly illegible, but the entries started out normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Just routine notes. Weather, mileage, sightings. The kind of things anyone would record during a hiking trip. The further Nash flipped, the more the entries began to change. One entry was dated July 7th. Sophie had trouble sleeping last night. She says she hears things in the trees. She swears someone is walking out there, but I don't hear anything. Probably just her imagination. Nash felt a chill run down his spine as he read. They were used to strange sounds in the woods, wild animals, the wind, the trees. But this was different. Daniel's entry shifted, slowly growing more uneasy, almost paranoid. By July 8th, Daniel's writing was more erratic, as if he was losing his calm. "We can't stay here anymore. I keep hearing things. I thought it was just the wind, but it's too deliberate. Someone's out there. I see shadows between the trees. Sophie says she sees them too. I don't know what to think anymore." The next few entries were hard to read, smeared from the rain, but there were fragments that made Nash's stomach twist. "It's too quiet here. We're not alone." Read the entry from July 9th. "Sophie's asking questions now. She wants to know what I'm seeing, but I can't tell her. I'm afraid she's starting to hear it too." The journal was growing darker. The entries, once filled with the excitement of a father and daughter's hiking adventure, were now consumed by fear. Nash flipped to the last entry, dated July 10th, the day they disappeared. The words were faint, the ink smudged by water, but it was clear enough. "We're not alone here," Daniel had written, the last words clear and precise. "I think she hears it too." Nash's hand froze. He reread the words again. "I think she hears it too." Who was Daniel referring to? What was he hearing? And more importantly, what was he running from? Nash passed the journal to Jared, his face grim. "This is it. This is the last thing he wrote." It's like he knew something was coming. He was trying to protect her. Jared scanned the pages quickly, his brow furrowed. He muttered something under his breath. "We are not alone." He shook his head, clearly disturbed. This doesn't make sense. Sophie's just a kid. What could she have possibly heard? Tom, who had been standing silently, stepped closer, his hand on his chin as he thought. We've been chasing shadows, haven't we? This isn't just a missing person case. Daniel was scared. He knew something was in those woods. And whatever it was after him and Sophie. Jared closed the journal and handed it back to Nesh. We need to find them. This journal might be the only clue we've got. Nash's mind raced. We're not alone here. The words echoed in his head. What had Daniel encountered? What had he heard in the woods? The hunters felt a cold weight in their chests. They weren't just searching for Daniel and Sophie anymore. They were searching for something else. Something that had been watching them, waiting. And it wasn't going to let them find the truth easily. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more it felt like the woods were closing in around them. Every step took them farther from the safety of the trailhead, and every tree, every rustling leaf, seemed to whisper a secret they weren't meant to hear. There were no signs of Daniel or Sophie, no footprints, no fresh campsites, just the deep, oppressive silence of the forest. Then, as they pushed forward, Nash's foot hit something, a soft thud under the leaves. He bent down, brushing away the debris to reveal what was clearly another piece of Sophie's belongings. It was a bird-watching journal, a small, weathered notebook, its cover faded but still bearing the image of a red-tailed hawk in flight. Nash opened it carefully, flipping through the pages. It was filled with sketches of birds, little notes about the species Sophie had spotted on their hikes. Each entry seemed like the simple, innocent musings of a young girl who loved nature, until he got to the last few pages. Her last notes were filled with erratic scribbles, lines of confusion. I hear them too. The trees move when no one is looking. Daddy doesn't believe me anymore. He says I'm imagining it, but I see them. I hear them. Nash's stomach turned. This wasn't just the innocent journal of a birdwatcher. Sophie had been hearing something, or someone, that Daniel hadn't. Jesus, Nash muttered, passing the journal to Tom. What the hell was going on with them? Jared stood silently, his eyes scanning the woods. We need to find out what they were running from. They continued searching, moving deeper into the thicket. Then Tom stopped, crouching beside something else half buried beneath a fallen log. It was a pair of Sophie's binoculars, their lens scratched but otherwise in good condition. How'd she leave these behind? Tom muttered. She wouldn't have dropped them unless something happened. Jared nodded grimly. Whatever it was, it made her leave everything behind. But they weren't done yet. The real clue came a few minutes later when Nash stumbled across a folded map. It wasn't one of the usual park maps. This one was hand-drawn, with pencil markings that looked like they'd been sketched in a hurry. The map was of the same area they were currently in, but with one significant difference. There was an unmarked area at the farthest edge of the woods, a section that wasn't on any of the official maps. A place labeled simply, the Basin. Nash traced his fingers over the map, the weight of the discovery sinking in. This wasn't on any map we've seen. It's like Daniel was hiding something he didn't want anyone to know. The map had more markings, arrows, crossed-out trails, and some unclear notes that didn't make sense. But there was one note that stood out. Check elevation. Steep drop west. It didn't fit with the rest of the trail plans they'd seen. It was almost as if Daniel had been trying to navigate this area himself, as if he was searching for something, or maybe trying to avoid something. This is it, Nash said, his voice tight. This is where they went. They were heading here. Jared took the map, his brow furrowed. But why? What was so important about this place? And why mark it if no one else was supposed to see it? The three men stood still, the weight of the map pressing down on them. There was a sense of urgency now, an unspoken agreement that they needed to follow this map, go deeper into the woods, and find the basin. But what would they find when they got there? And why had Daniel marked it so carefully, leaving clues that seemed to point to something hidden in the forest? I don't like this, Tom muttered, looking at the dense trees ahead. We're heading straight into unknown territory. We don't even know what we're looking for. We'll know when we find it, Jared replied, tucking the map into his jacket. But we're not stopping until we do. Whatever Daniel was afraid of, whatever Sophie was trying to warn us about, we need to face it. The hunters exchanged looks, their faces set with determination. They had come here to find a father and daughter, to unravel the mystery of their disappearance. But the deeper they went, the more it seemed like the woods were hiding something much bigger, something that didn't want to be found. And whatever it was waiting for them in the basin. The map had led them here, to a part of the forest that didn't belong to any official trail guide. A section marked only with a simple note: the basin. As they walked, the trees began to grow thicker, the underbrush denser. The path ahead grew faint, almost like the forest itself was trying to hide it. What had once been a clear trail was now barely discernible, a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to vanish under a blanket of leaves and moss. They had crossed the boundary now. Every step forward felt like a step further into the unknown, into a place that wasn't meant to be found. This is it, Nash muttered, his eyes scanning the tangled woods. We're on the trail. I can barely see it, but it's there. Jared nodded, his hand on the map as he traced their location. Barely a trail at all. Looks like it hasn't been used in years. The further they moved, the more the air seemed to change. The trees were taller here, their gnarled roots twisting out of the ground like fingers reaching for them. The usual forest sounds, the chirp of birds, the rustle of small animals, were muted, as though the woods themselves had gone still. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, hanging heavy in the air. Nash's boots crunched on the brittle leaves, and he stopped suddenly, holding up his hand. Wait, do you hear that? For a moment, the forest felt even quieter than it had before, until, faintly, a distant noise reached them, a crackling sound, like the snap of twigs underfoot. It was far away, but it wasn't wind. No, this was the sound of movement. Someone, or something, was nearby. Jared's eyes narrowed. Stay close, he ordered, his voice low but steady. They pressed forward, the path narrowing even more, until they stumbled into a small clearing, a place that had once been a campsite. But the sight of it only deepened the unease that had been building since they first arrived. The remains of a fire pit lay in the center of the clearing, the charred remnants of wood still visible. The ground around it was trampled, the dirt kicked up like someone had been walking in a hurry. A broken tent frame, collapsed and torn, lay half buried beneath a pile of branches. It was the kind of campsite that looked abandoned, but still had a fresh feel to it. Like it had been used recently, but by who? Jared crouched beside the fire pit, examining the remains of burnt wood. This doesn't add up, he muttered. Whoever was here, they didn't leave long ago. Nash kneeled beside the wreckage of the tent, his fingers brushing against a torn piece of fabric. It was old, disheveled, but still damp from the rain. It looks like it was torn open, but not in a way that says someone was attacked. More like it was abandoned in a hurry. Tom walked over to a small backpack half hidden beneath some brush. He picked it up carefully, his eyes scanning its contents. Nothing's missing. It's like they just left everything here. There was something wrong about this place. It was too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. The campsite was clearly used recently, but there was no sign of Daniel or Sophie, no indication that they had ever set up here. It was as though someone had been here, gone, and left nothing behind but remnants of their existence. This isn't right, Nash said, standing up and turning in a slow circle. It feels like we're being watched. Tom gripped his rifle a little tighter, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. There's no sign of anyone, no sign of Daniel, no sign of Sophie. But we can't shake this feeling that we're being followed. Jared's gaze was fixed on the overgrown trail, his mind working. Whoever was here didn't leave on their own, and they didn't go far. We need to keep moving. But as they stood there, the air growing heavier, the forest seemed to shift. The unease that had been creeping under their skin began to feel like something tangible. It was as if the forest itself was alive, not in the way of animals or plants, but in the way it seemed to watch, to listen, to wait. I don't like this, Tom said, his voice a low growl. This place feels wrong. Jared stared at the campsite, his mind racing. This trail was abandoned for a reason. It was forgotten for a reason. The pieces weren't adding up. Daniel and Sophie had been here. There was no question about it. But what had driven them to this place? And why hadn't they stayed? What had happened when they set up camp? And where had they gone after? There were still more questions than answers, and each one seemed to lead them further into a place they weren't prepared to face. They had been moving for hours, deeper into the woods, where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly, dark and gnarled, their limbs blocking out the sun. The trail had all but disappeared, and the map they had been following felt less and less like a guide and more like a taunt, leading them into places that made no sense. Then it came again. A whistle. Soft at first, almost a whisper in the wind. But this time, it didn't fade. It lingered in the air, cutting through the silence like a sharp, deliberate sound. The hunters froze, their eyes darting around the dense forest, the same feeling of being watched creeping up their spines. They had heard it before, on the first day of their search, but this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't in the distance. This time, it was closer. The whistle grew louder, its eerie tone rising and falling like a beckoning call. It was almost melodic, but too haunting to be a song. It was like a voice, distant but purposeful, luring them deeper into the shadows of the forest. Nash was the first to break the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is that?" Jared's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his back, his eyes scanning the trees. "It's the whistler." His voice was steady, but the uncertainty was clear. The stories had always been passed off as folklore, myths told by locals around campfires. No one took them seriously. But standing in the heart of the woods, hearing that sound, it was impossible to deny. It was as though the whistler was real, drawing them in like prey. The whistle pierced the silence again, this time so close, it felt like it was right behind them. Tom turned sharply, his breath quickening. "It's following us." Nash's heart raced, his hand tightening on his pack. "No, it can't be. It's just an animal, a bird or something." But even as he spoke, his voice trailed off, the sound of the whistle growing more insistent, more precise. It wasn't like the random calls of wildlife. This was deliberate. It sounded almost human, and that's what terrified them. Jared's eyes were wide, scanning the trees, the underbrush. No animal whistles like that. And animals don't follow you like this. This is something else. Another whistle, closer still. It was undeniable now. The hunters were being followed, not by something in the trees, not by wildlife or wind. By a presence. Tom gripped his rifle tightly, his nerves on edge. "We're being led somewhere." The thought was suffocating, like a cold hand wrapping around their throats. The air felt different now, thick, heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Every tree, every shadow seemed to be closing in around them, watching, waiting. Nash swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "We should turn back. This doesn't feel right." But Jared didn't move. He stood still, listening to the whistle echoing through the trees, pulling them forward like a thread pulling them deeper into the forest's grip. "We can't turn back," Jared said quietly. "Not now. We're too far in. We need answers." The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. It was as though they were being drawn toward it, as though something, someone, was deliberately guiding them into the heart of the forest. But what for? "We're not alone," Tom muttered under his breath, his hand tight on his rifle. "Something's out here. Something that doesn't want us to leave." The whistle echoed once more, louder and more insistent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't anything they'd ever heard in these woods before. And in that moment, they all realized it at the same time. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The whistle stopped as suddenly as it had started, and for a moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence of the forest. The hunters stood frozen, the sound still ringing in their ears, like a ghost that wouldn't leave. "Keep moving," Jared said, his voice tight. We're going to find Daniel and Sophie, and we're going to find out who or what is making that sound. They didn't know what awaited them. They didn't know who was following them or what they were walking into. All they knew was that the whistler, or something else, was leading them deeper into the wilderness, toward an answer they weren't prepared to find. The wind had picked up, and with it, a strange feeling settled into the pit of the hunters' stomachs. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the sound of the whistle lingering in their minds. It was the growing sense that they were being led. They pushed through the thick underbrush, their eyes searching for anything that would bring them closer to Daniel and Sophie. But the deeper they went, the more isolated they felt. The woods felt like they were closing in around them, thick with fog and shadows. Nash was the first to spot something. His foot struck a small, weathered plastic case, half buried beneath a pile of dead leaves. He crouched down and carefully pulled it free from the dirt. The case was small, clearly designed for something fragile. "Look at this," he said, holding it up. Tom and Jared moved closer, their expressions immediately shifting from curiosity to concern. Nash opened the case with a quick snap. Inside was a voice recorder, old but well kept, the kind that a child might use to capture the sounds of nature, or perhaps, in Sophie's case, to document her adventures in the wilderness. The recorder was turned on, its screen flickering weakly. For a moment, all the hunters could do was stare at it, the weight of the discovery settling heavily in the air. "We need to hear this," Jared said quietly, his voice tight. Nash pressed the play button. At first, there was nothing but static, the kind that you'd expect from a recorder left on for too long. But then, faintly, the sound of breathing came through, slow, steady, like someone trying to calm themselves. Then, clear as day, they heard a small voice. "Sophie," Jared whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. It was Sophie's voice, but it was different. Soft, trembling. "Daddy's asleep," Sophie's voice wavered through the static, her words slow, as if she was trying not to wake him. "I think they're still out there." The message was short, too short. The sound of Sophie's voice cut off abruptly. The static returned, a faint hiss, and then nothing. Just silence. A silence so deep it felt like the air itself had frozen. "Jesus," Tom muttered, his voice barely audible. "What the hell is that?" Nash's fingers trembled as he paused the recorder. The last words Sophie had spoken echoed in the hunters' minds. "I think they're still out there." The hairs on the back of Nash's neck stood on end. Who was they? Jared's face was pale, his hand gripping the recorder tightly. What did she mean by they? He whispered, his words thick with disbelief. Who is out there with her? They all knew the stories. The whistler, the mysterious figure that people said could drive you mad with its eerie, haunting calls. But Sophie's words felt more real, more present than any local legend. Whatever they were with her and Daniel. And now, with this voice recorder, they were hearing it firsthand. Nash glanced at the others, his voice low. "We need to get to them. They could be close. Maybe they're just—" "Maybe," Jared interrupted, shaking his head. "But this doesn't sound like something we can fix by just walking in there and calling their names." Sophie was scared. She was trying to warn us. The wind picked up again, and the woods grew darker. The whistle was faint now, but it was still there, like an eerie background hum. The hunters stood still, listening. "Let's keep moving," Tom said, his voice strained. He was the first to turn back toward the trees, the first to step forward despite the unease gnawing at his gut. "We can't waste time." But Jared didn't move. He stood, staring at the recorder in his hands, lost in thought. "We have to find out who they are. Whoever or whatever it is it's watching them. Watching us." Nash nodded, his face grim. "We need to move faster. Every second counts." They didn't speak as they continued, but the weight of the recorder's message hung in the air like a curse. Sophie was out there, still scared, still running. She wasn't just lost, she was being hunted. The woods grew darker, the sound of the whistle returning, louder now, almost as if it were beckoning them forward. Every crack of a twig underfoot felt like it might be their last. But they couldn't stop. Not now. They had heard Sophie's voice. They had heard her warning. And now, they knew something more than ever before. They weren't the only ones searching. There was something else in the woods. Something that was following them all. The deeper they moved into the woods, the less the forest felt like a place they could control. The trees closed in tighter, and the shadows seemed darker, heavier. It wasn't just the fading light of the day that created this sense of confinement. It was something else. Something alive. The whistle returned, unmistakable this time. Low, clear, deliberate. It cut through the dense silence of the woods like a knife, sharp and haunting. It seemed to hover in the air around them, just beyond the reach of their ears. And it wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human in its precision. Jared froze, his breath catching. "It's him," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He had heard the stories. The Whistler. A myth. A local legend passed around in hushed tones, something parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. But standing here, hearing that whistle, a sound so clear, so real, Jared couldn't shake the growing feeling that this was no myth. The air around them grew heavier, thicker, as if the woods were alive, watching, waiting, listening. Tom's hand tightened around his rifle, his jaw clenched. He didn't speak, but the tension in his body was evident. He too felt it, the creeping sensation that they were no longer in control of their search. They weren't just hunting anymore. They were being hunted. Nash, usually quick to crack a joke to break the tension, now stood still, his eyes scanning the trees. "This isn't good," he said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of fear. "This whistle, it's leading us somewhere, but it feels wrong. Like we're being pulled into a trap." The whistle echoed again, this time louder, closer. It was undeniable. Someone, or something, was deliberately following them. The presence behind the sound was growing more real, more tangible. They weren't alone. Tom's voice was low, barely a whisper. "Is it the Whistler? Or something else? Something worse?" The thought lingered in the air, heavy with its implications. The Whistler had always been an old story, a tale meant to frighten children into staying close to campfires. But now, standing in the deepening shadows of the woods, the legend felt less like fiction and more like an eerie truth. Something was in the woods with them. And whatever it was, it had been watching them from the very beginning. Jared's voice broke the silence, low but firm. "I don't know what it is, but it's real. And it's not going to let us leave until we understand what happened to Daniel and Sophie." Nash didn't argue, but his eyes were wide with fear. "We don't know what we're dealing with," he said, the unease clear in his voice. "We've been hearing this whistle, but we haven't even seen anything. Not one clue. No sign of them. Nothing." The trees seemed to grow thicker with each step, the path less distinguishable. The map they were following was becoming useless. What they were chasing was no longer on paper. It was in the very air around them. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the leaves felt like something was out there, just beyond the line of sight. The trees, the shadows, even the wind felt like it was conspiring against them, pushing them deeper into the unknown. Then came another whistle, this one closer. So close, it felt as though it was in their ears, reverberating through their skulls. Nash's heart pounded in his chest. "It's not the wind. It's not just some bird. It's—" He paused, the words hanging in the air. He didn't know how to finish that thought. "It's real." They all stood in silence for a moment, listening to the whistle echo once more. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. It was the forest calling them in, drawing them toward something they weren't meant to find. Jared took a step forward, his voice unwavering but filled with resolve. "We're going in. We don't stop until we find them." But even as he spoke, the woods seemed to close in. The whistle had stopped, but its presence lingered. The wind picked up, whipping around them, carrying the smell of wet earth and decay. The trees groaned, their branches creaking like old bones in the wind, and for a moment, It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Tom looked around, his grip tightening on his rifle. "I don't like this," he muttered. But there was no turning back. Not now. They had come too far. The whistler was real, and it was leading them somewhere they had to go, whether they were ready or not. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whistle stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Jared took a slow breath, trying to steady his nerves. "We keep moving. We can't stop now. Whatever's out here, whatever is behind the whistle, we need to find it. We need to find them." The forest was no longer just a place of trees, rocks, and trails. It was something else now. Something alive. The deeper they went, the more it felt as though the woods were guiding them, pulling them towards something hidden, something ancient. Every piece of the puzzle they had found so far, the journal, the map, Sophie's voice on the recorder, wasn't leading them toward a simple explanation. No. They were on the edge of uncovering something much darker. Jared, Nash, and Tom had reached a point in their search where they could no longer ignore the creeping feeling that this wasn't just a missing persons case. This wasn't just a father and daughter who had wandered off the trail. This was something more. Something far more dangerous. They had the map, the markings, the strange, hidden path that Daniel had followed, and they had the journal, a document filled with cryptic entries that spoke of paranoia, fear, and whispers in the woods. And then there were the whispers themselves, soft, eerie, calling them deeper into the forest. Each step brought them closer to something. But what? Nash was the first to break the silence as they stopped near a clearing. His voice was low, almost cautious. "I think I know where Daniel went. I think we are getting closer to the truth." Jared turned to him, his brow furrowed. "How?" Nash nodded to the map in his hand. "This hidden place. The basin. It's not just a random spot. Daniel marked it for a reason. He was trying to get away from something. Something that was already in these woods." Tom glanced nervously around the clearing. "You think it's the whistler?" "I don't think it's just the whistler," Jared replied, his voice tense. "I think the whistler is the manifestation of something older, something darker, something that the forest has been hiding for generations. It's not just a ghost or a spirit. It's a force, a predator." The wind picked up again, sending a cold shiver down their spines. The whistle sounded again in the distance, but this time it wasn't a beckoning call. It was close, almost like a warning. "We're being drawn toward it," Nash said, his voice strained. "But why? What is it that we're walking into?" Jared took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew they were getting closer. The final piece of the puzzle was within their reach, but they had to keep going. The hunters pushed forward, their path growing steeper, more treacherous. The trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows longer, the air heavier. The closer they got to the heart of the forest, the more they felt the presence of something watching them. It wasn't until they reached a narrow, overgrown trail that they made their final discovery. The path was choked with vines and fallen branches, barely visible to the naked eye. But there, in the underbrush, they found something shocking, an old, abandoned structure, half hidden by the trees. It was a small cabin, its windows boarded up, its wooden walls weathered and cracked from years of neglect. But what caught their attention wasn't the cabin itself, it was what they found inside. The door creaked open with a faint groan as they entered. The inside was a mess of old, broken furniture, but in the corner, covered by a thick layer of dust, they found a shelf lined with journals, maps, and what appeared to be old photographs. The journals were similar to the one Daniel had been carrying, filled with scribbled notes about strange occurrences in the forest, stories of people vanishing, whispers in the night. But one journal stood out. It wasn't like the others. This one was older, its pages yellowed with age. Jared flipped through it carefully, the words leaping out at him. The entries grew more frantic as the pages turned. The writer spoke of seeing things, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, figures lurking just out of sight. And then, near the end, there was a chilling entry. "It's not just the whistler," the journal read. "The whistler is the echo of something older. Something that has always been here, feeding on those who wander too far. It is not human. It is hunger, and it has no end. Nash's heart pounded in his chest. That's what Daniel was trying to warn us about. That's what he knew. Jared's fingers trembled as he turned the page, his mind racing. He had read these words before, in Daniel's journal. The same whispers, the same fear. Daniel had known what was out there. He had known that it wasn't just a ghost, but something far more terrifying. A predator. A force that had existed long before anyone stepped into these woods. Tom, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his face pale. So, what is it? What do we do? Jared stared at the final pages of the journal, his thoughts heavy. We find the source. We face it. And we end this, once and for all. But as they looked out toward the woods beyond, the whistle came again, louder than ever. And this time, it wasn't just calling them. It was waiting for them. The forest had grown darker as they continued, the canopy above thickening and casting long, twisted shadows across their path. Every step felt more deliberate, like the woods themselves were watching them, urging them forward. There was no longer any question of just finding Daniel and Sophie. Now, the hunters felt as though they were on the brink of discovering something far darker, something that the forest had been hiding for generations. They had already uncovered enough evidence to understand that what they were up against wasn't just a missing person's case. It was something alive, something ancient. But now, they had come to the edge. The trail ended abruptly, the ground beneath their feet giving way to a sheer drop. Nash took a few tentative steps forward, peering over the edge. Below, the earth sloped down sharply, the rocks jagged and unforgiving. The trees at the bottom of the ravine were small, twisted, and sparse. The drop was almost impossible to gauge, but one thing was clear. No one could have survived that fall. We've reached the end of the line, Nash said, his voice tight with frustration. This is where it stops. Jared stood at his side, staring down into the ravine, his brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of the scene. This is where their tracks lead. This is the last sign we have. He looked back at the path they had come from, then down at the drop. But there's nothing here. No footprints, no sign that they were pushed. Tom finished for him, his voice dark. The thought hung in the air, thick with the possibility. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. The feeling of unease that had plagued them all along began to crawl under their skin again. They had followed the tracks this far, through the dense woods, across hidden trails, and into the heart of the forest, only to find this. Nothing. No sign of Daniel or Sophie beyond these final footprints. But as Nash crouched to inspect the ground, his eyes caught something faint in the dirt, almost hidden by the overgrowth. He brushed away the leaves and soil, revealing a set of footprints, faint but still visible. One set was large, clearly belonging to Daniel. The other, much smaller, was Sophie's. They led to the edge of the cliffside. But the trail didn't stop there. The footprints didn't vanish into the air this time, nor were they swept away by time. No, they faded. It was as if they had been erased by some force that wasn't natural. There was no further trace, no disturbance, no evidence of a struggle. Just these two sets of tracks, leading to the edge, and then nothing. They came this far, Nash muttered under his breath, tracing the faded prints with his fingers. But they didn't fall. They didn't just vanish. Something else happened here. Jared stood silently, his mind racing. So, what? They were pulled off the trail? Or guided? Maybe they walked right to the edge and… He stopped, the words dying in his throat as the unsettling reality began to sink in. What if they hadn't fallen? What if they had been led here? Tom's eyes narrowed, scanning the edge of the cliffside. We've seen it before. The whispers. The whistling. That thing, whatever it is, was guiding them. The forest isn't just hiding them, it's hiding the truth. They had seen enough by now. The whistler, the strange occurrences, Sophie's cryptic warnings, Daniel's growing fear, it was all connected. The woods were hiding something. Something that had claimed the lives of others before. Something that was far beyond their understanding. Nash reached into his pack, pulling out the map again. He studied it, his gaze flicking back to the edge of the ravine. There's nothing here. Nothing on the map that shows what's beyond this point. Jared stepped closer to the cliff's edge, looking down into the abyss below. Maybe the map doesn't show it for a reason. Maybe whatever's down there, it's not supposed to be found. And that's when he saw it. Beneath a pile of leaves, partially hidden by the overgrowth, was something small, something that didn't belong. It was a broken compass, its glass cracked, its needle frozen, pointing nowhere. The symbol on its back was worn, barely legible, but the hunters recognized it. It was the same symbol that had appeared in Daniel's journal, the symbol they had seen marked on the map. Jared picked it up carefully, his fingers brushing the surface of the cold metal. He turned it over in his hands, and the weight of the discovery settled in. This was his. It was in his pack. This is a sign. A sign of what? Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jared didn't answer at first. He was still staring at the compass, his mind working through the implications. The compass had been with Daniel, and it was pointing to nothing. The way the footprints led to the edge, and the way the compass had failed. It was as if Daniel had been drawn here, forced to walk to the edge of the cliff. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a missing person case. This was a trap, and Daniel and Sophie were part of it. The whistle sounded again, closer now, as if it were following them. But the hunters didn't turn back. Not now. Not when they were this close. They had to find the truth. They had to understand what had happened at the edge of the cliff, and what had happened to Daniel and Sophie. But deep down, they all knew whatever was waiting at the end of the trail was not human, and they were about to confront something far darker than they could have ever imagined. The journey back to town felt like a slow, suffocating retreat. The dense woods had swallowed their every step, and yet they had emerged from the depths with nothing. Nothing but questions that only seemed to multiply the more they searched. Nothing but the weight of a mystery that had no end. The whistler, that chilling sound that had followed them through the forest, was still there, lingering in the back of their minds like a bad memory that refused to fade. As the hunters made their way back to the trailhead, they passed the Subaru once more, the same car they had found days ago, still parked in the same place, its windows rolled up, its engine cold. The air was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that settled over you like a blanket, smothering any hope of answers. Nash was the first to speak, his voice flat. "We're going back with nothing. There's no sign of Daniel and Sophie. No clue. No explanation." Tom shook his head, his face grim. "This whole thing's just wrong. We found clues, sure, but they don't lead anywhere. We can't even say what happened." Jared's eyes were distant as he stared into the woods. He hadn't said much since they left the cliffside, still processing everything they had uncovered. The map, the journal, the compass, the whistler, and the strange feeling that had grown in his gut the longer they stayed in the forest. There was something about those woods, something older than all of them, something that didn't want to be found. "We can't ignore what we found," Jared said quietly. "There's something in those woods, something powerful, something alive." Tom scoffed, but there was no humor in his voice. "Alive? The whistler is alive? That's just a story, Jared. Something to scare kids. You can't seriously believe that." "I don't know what to believe anymore," Jared muttered, turning away from the others, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "But I know one thing for sure. Daniel and Sophie didn't just disappear. They were led to something in those woods. And whatever it is, it's still there." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the creaking of the trees and the distant call of a bird. The road ahead was empty, but the weight of the forest seemed to linger, pulling them back into its depths. Nash glanced back at the thick woods one last time. "What do we tell them? The town? Their families? What can we say when we've got nothing?" Jared didn't respond. He couldn't. No matter how hard they tried, The mystery would remain unsolved. The Whistler would continue to haunt the woods. Daniel and Sophie's fates would stay locked in the trees, hidden beneath a veil of shadows and whispers. "We go back," Jared said finally, his voice low. "We tell them the truth. We tell them we searched, and we came back with nothing. But we don't forget what we found in those woods. Not the forest, not the Whistler, not the journal, not the compass." "Then what?" Tom asked, his tone sharp. "Then we wait," Jared replied, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Because whatever is out there isn't done yet. It's still waiting for the next pair to wander too far." The hunters walked in silence toward the town, the weight of what they had discovered hanging heavily between them. They had come to the forest searching for answers, but all they had found were more questions, more mystery. The town had no answers either. When the hunters returned, they reported the search, everything they had found, the journal, the map, the broken compass, the whispers, and the Whistler. But the people who listened were skeptical. They had heard the legends, the stories of people lost in the woods, but they never believed them. They couldn't. Not without proof. The forest remained silent, but the hunters knew something they couldn't explain. The Whistler wasn't just a myth. It was real. And it wasn't done with them yet. They left the town behind with no answers. But as they drove away, heading back to their lives, they could feel the presence of the forest still watching them. It was as if the trees, the ground, the very air held on to their secrets, unwilling to let go of the mysteries they had uncovered.